I'd like to begin with two beliefs. These beliefs have dictated most of my young life, and they predicate today's talk. My first belief is simple. It's that entrepreneurship is the answer to most every single issue we face today. And my second belief is maybe a little less uncommon. But when I look at the world today, I believe that the world is in a better place than it's ever been before in the history of humankind. My belief is that I choose to be an optimist, but the data speaks for itself. Illiteracy rates have halved since the last century. The number of democracies have tripled since 1940. And today, billions of us have access to the world's information ubiquitously at our fingertips. We have more power today than we've ever had before in the history of humankind, and the world is better poised to be in a better place ever before in the history of humankind. Now, I'm not just an optimist. My dad, if I just stopped there, would say that I was a naive optimist, but the truth is I'm an impatient optimist. Because when I look at the world today, we may be in better shape than we've been before, but we also know the numbers, and we're facing some massive challenges. You know the data. There are over 2.6 billion people living on less than $2 a day. There are 1.1 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water. We live in a world where preventable ailments like diarrhea just last year killed 1.7 million children under the age of 5. So the world may be in a better place than it's ever been before, but it's not good enough. And it's this juxtaposed belief, this impatient optimism that has driven me towards a bias towards action. And so when I was younger, a couple years ago, I decided to research. What is the world doing about these challenges? And when I was in university, that took me to studying the United Nations. What I learned was that in 1990, the United Nations got together and they created what they call the UN Millennium Development Goals. These goals were to be reached 25 years later by the year 2015. Number one on their list of Millennium Development Goals was to have the number of people living in absolute poverty on less than $1.25 a day. So now it's 2013, 23 years later, after these goals were set. They had 186 nations sign that charter. They had hundreds of billions of dollars that they put into it. We had the global infrastructure to make it happen. And the question is, what happened? We're 2 years out from 2015. And if we zoom in on one section of the world, if we zoom in on sub-Saharan Africa specifically, which is most ridden with extreme poverty, I think the situation is very telling. Now, the good news is we have seen a decrease in the proportion of sub-Saharan Africans living in absolute poverty. The bad news is that decrease is far from enough. In 1990, there were 44.6% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa living on less than $1.25 a day. We fast forward 20 years to 2010, 44.0%. We are going about this with incredible inaccuracy. And what's scariest about these numbers is because of population increase in sub-Saharan Africa, this means that there are now 140 million more individuals in sub-Saharan Africa now in absolute poverty than there were in 1990. Albert Einstein has a great definition of insanity. He says it's when we do the same thing over and over again, and we expect different results. Now, this is where my obsession and my belief in entrepreneurs kicks in, because entrepreneurs, they disrupt the status quo. They refuse to accept things for how they are, and they're constantly adapting and changing our modes towards what we want to achieve. And what I'm hoping to do in this talk is tell you a couple stories about 3 entrepreneurs that I've had the privilege to work with over these past few years as my role at the Unreasonable Institute and at a Reasonable Group. Now, I've worked with dozens of entrepreneurs like the 3 I'm about to tell you about, and the common thread throughout all of them is they refuse to accept the status quo. They have too much ADD to fall victim to Einstein's definition of insanity. They can't do the same thing over and over again and just wait for different results. They demand action now. So I hope that after I tell you these 3 stories, you will join me in believing in this notion of impatient optimism. The first entrepreneur I want to tell you about is this man. His name's Mishkin. He's an incredibly bright young guy, and he was working at the global consultancy firm called McKinsey. And a couple years into his job, he decided that he wanted to jump into a boyhood dream that he always had, which was to jump on a motorcycle ride across the subcontinent of India with one of his best friends. So he did it. He takes a month off of work. He flies out to Mumbai, which is where he's from. He jumps on his motorcycle, and he goes 2 hours north to a small village where his friend, who just so happens to be a doctor, is waiting for him. That's where they're going to start their trip. He gets up to this village, 2 hours north of the city, and he looks for his friend, and he can't find his friend anywhere. And so he asks some of the villagers, and one of the villagers tells him that his friend, the doctor, is actually performing a birth right now, or helping a woman perform a birth in a small shack at the edge of the village. So Mishkin rides his bike out to that small shack, and he waits outside. And he waits for his friend who's helping to perform this birth. And he waits, and 10 minutes goes by, and 30 minutes goes by, an hour goes by, another hour, and finally his friend walks out of the shack. And Mishkin looks at his friend, and he knows something terrible has happened. They connect eyes, and his friend's face goes completely white. Mishkin asks his friend, he says, "What's wrong?" And he said that the mother died during the birth, and her baby girl died too. And Mishkin looks at his friend, and he doesn't understand what happened. And he says, "Well, how could that possibly be?" And his friend, the doctor, tells him that what happened was postpartum hemorrhaging, which is caused by excessive bleeding, which is a symptom of anemia. Now, Mishkin isn't a doctor, right? He's a consultant at McKinsey, but he knows that this issue of anemia is incredibly easy to treat. All you need to do are take iron tablets. What's most upsetting to Mishkin about this whole situation is that a mile away in the middle of the village, there's a health clinic subsidized by the government for free were iron tablets that would have prevented this death. A mile away was the solution, and yet a mother and her baby girl both died. Mishkin looked at this issue of anemia, he dove into it, and he realized that he had to figure out what was really going on. And as he researched, he realized that anemia is a really big issue, much larger than just that small experience with it. Today, it's the #1 killer of women and their children during pregnancies and during birth. Every single minute, unfortunately, a woman and her child die, caused by postpartum hemorrhaging, just like the woman that Mishkin experienced that day. And so Mishkin decided he's going to quit his job. He had to dive into this. He had to listen to his heart. And he rallied up a small team of doctors and engineers that didn't necessarily know what to do, but they realized they wanted to solve the problem. What they realized is that the issue isn't treatment, it's detection. Because our system for detecting anemia requires that you draw somebody's blood. You have to take a sample. What that means is in rural villages, in places like India where specialists don't exist, you need a specialist. They'd have to travel out to that village. They'd have to convince the women to prick their finger to draw blood. This takes trust where trust doesn't exist. Then they take that blood, go back into the city, process it in the lab, and then go back to the village, and they have the results. This never happens. The real issue is because you have to draw blood. So Mishkin and his team, they decided to devote themselves to creating a new type of biotechnology that wouldn't require that you draw blood to detect anemia. What's amazing is through blood, sweat, tears, in a couple years, they built it. This is their biotechnology. It's called the Touch HB. You can see there's a little clamp on this device. It goes onto your pointer finger, and it shines a light on your finger. It reflects and refracts off the amount of hemoglobin in your blood. With 95% accuracy, instantly it tells you if you are anemic or not. This invention was ranked by the World Health Organization as the 6 most important inventions of our lifetime. One of the 6 most important inventions, not of the year, of our lifetime. This was created by a foolhardy entrepreneur. The next entrepreneur I want to tell you about is this man named Moses Sanga. Sanga's from a small village in Uganda. He grew up in the middle of a civil war. He didn't have shoes until he was 13 years old. He had never seen a computer until he was 17 years old. But he was one of those rare individuals in his village who was fortunate enough to get an education and to step outside of the village. And a couple years later, when he was in his early 20s, he found himself working a job at a microfinance institution in the capital of his country, in Kampala. And after working there for a couple months, he missed his family. He decided that he wanted to go home and visit his mom. And so he travels back to his village. The last leg of this trip back to his village is walking down a dirt path. And he's walking down this dirt path, and he runs into his little sister. It's amazing. He hasn't seen her in forever, and this should have been a joyous moment, but it wasn't. His little sister had a bundle of twigs and of wood on her head, and she was walking like this down the road. And when she saw her older brother, she broke down, she started crying, she dropped all the wood. And Sanga asked his sister, he said, "What's the matter?" And she said that she had to walk 10 kilometers that morning to gather wood to bring it back home for cooking fuel. And that she missed school that day, and that she had to do this 2 days earlier. And that odds were she wasn't going to finish school because she wasn't able to get an education because she had to go fetch wood. Sangha felt the plight of his sister. He decided he had to quit his job, just like Michigan did, and he had to dive into solving this problem. And when he looked at the problem, he realized that it was much larger than just his sister. This is an issue that is a symptom of a much larger challenge right now across the continent of Africa, and that is deforestation. 90% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa today uses wood for cooking fuel. Because of that, countries like Uganda have already seen 70% of their forests wiped clean. The UN has issued a charter that says by 2052, if we don't do anything to curb the level of deforestation across the continent of Africa, we will have no forest left by 2052. The continent will fall into desertification. So Sangha looked at this and he said, okay, I have to do something about it. The solution's very obvious. If the problem is that we're using wood for fuel, let's find a new material. And he did. This is a photograph of what a lot of sub-Saharan Africa looks like today, where women and girls, like Sangha's little sister, have to walk to fetch wood. What Sangha did is he created a new fuel. This is called biochar. What's amazing, it has the same properties of wood. It actually burns a little bit cleaner than wood does, but it's made not out of wood, it's made out of agricultural waste. And so he's taking a waste and he's creating it, and he's making it into a fuel. So Sangha, when he decided to quit his job and launch this new company, he had only $500 in his bank account. He took all that money and he put it into developing a technology that would allow him to create this biochar. He created a new form of kelms, and it works. Today, he's working with thousands of farmers, collecting their agricultural waste, converting it into this biochar, and he's employing hundreds of women to go out and sell this biochar in market. What's amazing is not only is it not wood, not only is it a clean fuel, it's also cheaper than wood because agricultural waste is plentiful in areas like rural Uganda. Moses has effectively created a financially viable and profitable way to combat deforestation across sub-Saharan Africa and to ensure that millions of girls, like his sister, can now go to school, not needing to walk 10 kilometers a day to go gather wood. The last team that I want to tell you about is combating potentially the biggest challenge of our time. I say I'm an optimist, but when I look at things like climate change, you realize the scale at which global warming is moving and the pace at which it is growing. I think it's easy to become a pessimist. But I had the privilege of working with a small team of misfit scientists and engineers who are combating climate change in a way that I think will even make the biggest skeptics an optimist. They're a group of nanotechnologists. Now, like Sangha in Uganda, they're taking a waste and they're turning it into a resource. But this waste is the most prolific waste of our time. They're capturing carbon emissions. What they've done is they've created a simple technology that latches onto the chimney of a factory like this one. It uses the heat from the chimney to elicit a process of combustion, and then they apply a nanotechnology to the process that converts carbon emissions into this material called carbon nanotubes. Now, carbon nanotubes is a wonder material. It's 20 times stronger than steel, it's 5 times lighter than steel, it has 300 times the connectivity of copper. It is literally worth more than gold in its weight. Quite literally, these entrepreneurs are modern-day alchemists, taking carbon emissions out of the atmosphere and profitably converting it into a material worth more than gold. The moment that this technology hits the market, everything can change. Because the moment that you turn a waste into a commodity is the moment that we'll race to capture carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. Now, these 3 stories, the stories of Michigan, of Sangha, and of the team at Damascus Fortune, they are evidence in my mind that we have due cause to be impatient optimists. And they are evidence in my mind that if we're going to have a chance in hell at putting a dent on some of these UN Millennial Development Goals, like eradicating extreme poverty, we need to hedge our bets on our entrepreneurs. Now, in closing, I don't think I'd be doing this conversation justice if I didn't talk about not just the merits of entrepreneurship, but also the arch nemesis to entrepreneurship. This is, in my mind, the worst word in the English dictionary. It starts with a B. It is the Achilles heel to anybody who is an impatient optimist. And this worst word is, of course, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, by its very nature, thrives off the persistence of the status quo, and I believe that it's bureaucracy which is crippling our potential to reach these UN Millennial Development Goals. If you look at the numbers today, they're saying that on average, 30% or 30 cents on every dollar given through foreign aid actually meets those in need in market. That means that 70% of our foreign aid is going into the costs of overhead, bureaucracy, and corruption. This isn't effective. We need to use a more nimble approach based on meritocracy that actually leveraged markets instead of political systems and aid to try to solve our problems. In closing, I'd like to quote a man who said it much better than myself. In 7 Pillars of Wisdom, it was said that most men dream in the dusty recesses of their mind, only to awaken and realize it was all in vain. But be wary of those few men, those dangerous few, who dream with their eyes open, for they may realize their dreams in the light of day. I challenge all of us, myself included, let's be a little bit more optimistic. Let's be a little bit more impatient about solving the hardest problems of our time. Let's be a little bit more entrepreneurial, may I say a little bit less bureaucratic, and then together we can dream with our eyes open. Thank you very much. Domo arigato.